We're doing it live now.
We're live.
Doing it live.
Oh God, that happened. Hello, everyone, and welcome to my YouTube channel. This is Insurrection with Brenton Lengel, and I am joined here with Bobby B of the Mustache Mafia podcast. Bobby, do you want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Ladies, gentlemen, fluids, I'm Bobby B of the Mustache Mafia podcast. Yes, I did just rip that line off from Avenue 5. Yes, watch it while you're on lockdown. I am here to talk with Brenton about Homage to Catalonia. We're on chapter 9 now. I think we're like halfway there.
I'm really excited because we're getting into the really exciting parts of the book. And like one of the things about Homage to Catalonia, because Orwell writes about kind of the reality of war, is that it's not a very exciting book. Like and when it is exciting, Orwell does not describe it in an exciting way. He describes it in a beautiful way, but the guy was not known for his thrillers.
Which is funny because 1984 is a thrilling and horrifying book, but it is actually very slow paced when you try to think about it.
Yeah. Well, Orwell Orwell in general, I think he is somewhat allergic to good pacing. That's part of maybe being influenced by the Victorian novel, and maybe also part of the fact that leftists oftentimes, for authenticity's sake, feel the need to dress like crap and have zero production values.
Yeah, you're not wrong. Because I was reading about Brecht earlier, and I was reflecting on, like, of course I like Brecht plays because they're designed to alienate you, and I hadn't realized that he was like specifically doing like bad production values and alienating you from the characters on purpose to do a dialectical point. I'm like, of course I like this. It's depressing on purpose.
Well, which would make sense with the rest of the stuff that you've read. So you are I'm excited about this though, because this is the chapter where like the shit really starts to hit the fan. Now to catch people up, where have we been and what are we about to go into?
So we've been on the front line most of the time with Orwell. We met him when he was coming to Catalonia to join the POUM, the POUM Anarchist militia. Is it pronounced?
I've heard it pronounced the POUM like that, both in person by activists and also by, if you watch the movie Land and Freedom, which is about this and in large part based on Orwell's book, they call it the POUM as well.
I guess that makes more sense, and it sounds a little cooler than saying POUM. But he had a very, very, very brief and truncated basic training with the anarchist militia he joined, and we've been
I should specify, so the POUM is not an anarchist militia, though they're very close in the way they operate. Orwell, they are specifically a left Marxist. The Stalinists called them Trotskyists, and they were at one time, but they are not Trotskyists anymore. Though that is going to come to bite them in the ass, as we're all going to see.
And with all the acronyms, I think you can forgive me for the mistake every now and then.
Well, Orwell said that when he first came to Spain, he was worried that they were suffering from an attack of letters because of all of the different parties scrawled all over everything.
Which is exactly what happened. But after his truncated militia training, we got to see him go to a pretty uneventful front, which was very disappointing for him because he wanted to have a Rambo action story.
And that did not happen. He did take place in an attack directly on the fascist lines that then later turned out to be which was a successful attack, but it turned out that the successful attack was just supposed to be a feint, and the real attack was unfortunately unsuccessful. Yeah,
which is a classical military phrase: "No plan survives first contact with the enemy," and that always happens. That
seems to happen in boxing. Everybody has a plan until they get hit.
Until they get hit in the face. Orwell almost got hit when he almost got shot a couple of times.
Indeed.
It's a very full-throated story. People who have read the book got that joke.
You saw I laughed at that. We haven't gotten to that point yet.
That's a little banter. But in chapter 9, Orwell's coming back to the city, and he's seeing what's going on behind the lines. Mm-hmm. And this was a really cool chapter for me because I related a lot to this, because the experience of coming back to a peaceful area after you've been in a war zone is ubiquitously weird for like all soldiers. And I think Orwell's is a lot weirder than mine was, because I came back to relatively speaking, stable country in the United States, whereas he comes back to well, as stable as we ever were. Orwell comes back to a very unstable situation, but he experiences a lot of things that are kind of universal. And there's actually a really interesting bit in this chapter where I get to talk about the gold standard and put everybody to sleep.
Great! Talking about the gold standard. Now, what's important for people to remember about this, if you're just joining us, so this is the city of Barcelona, and Barcelona is the site of when Spain's military went fascist. They tried to take over the whole country, and the anarchists, led by, among others, Buenaventura Durruti, who I'm working on a comic book and I've written a film about. Film, by the way, it's not 100% yet, but I think we're getting optioned, which is really, really exciting. They took up the defense of Barcelona, defeated the fascists, and this was like one of the only times a modern mechanized army was defeated by a civilian force armed with homemade bombs and antique rifles, and collectivized the entire city, ran it on an anarcho-communist model for like up to 3 years. And then, well, we'll find out as this chapter continues. This is a fascinating piece of history, and it's something that a lot of people don't know much about, or if they do know anything about it, all they know is there were anarchists, and at some point the fascists won, and therefore anarchism is. Don't look at it. Don't think about it. Don't go into it. Definitely don't read any history books on it or learn the details. Just remember, anarchism bad. And remember, Orwell hated communism. No, he doesn't. So that's my necessary disclaimer out of the way, just because I have had to freaking headlock a few idiots about this. There was even a leftist debate on Modern Day Debate that I had to run to the after party just to correct everybody on the record on Catalonia, because apparently I'm just that big of a nerd.
Well, it is annoying because Orwell has been remembered in history as the guy who hates communism because of 1984. Mm-hmm. And because that's the only Orwell book anyone ever reads.
Well, and also 1984 and Animal Farm, and they always get the ending of Animal Farm wrong because they think that teachers will teach it this way as a denunciation of communism, when really it's a denunciation of totalitarianism, and it equates Stalin not as worse than the capitalists, but as the same thing as the capitalists. In the end, the pigs and the humans are, you can't tell the difference between them. It's not that the pigs have reached some level of inhumanity that the previous farmer had not yet reached.
I thought it was that Orwell was a furry the whole time.
He may have been a furry. God. Orwell, can you imagine him on the front line in a fursuit?
I can imagine that pretty easily, actually. But coming back from the front line is the theme of this chapter, and that's interesting. And I'm going to recommend a book now before we go forward. If you're curious about more of the experiences that he's having in this chapter specifically, there's a really great book called The Forever War, which isn't a documentary, which is something that I thought it was when I picked it up, but it's actually a really interesting science fiction story about a soldier who gets deployed repeatedly in the future to a war zone. And while he's deployed for 6 months, 20 years pass, and it gets exponential as he's deployed further and further away from Earth. And Orwell has some of the experiences in that book in this chapter. Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry, that was it.
No. We're sorry, I was posting in a couple of groups just to scare up. We've got a pretty good audience at the moment, and it's growing, so that's really exciting. So let's get into this. So chapter 9, he's back to Barcelona from the front. Now, it's also important to remember, because we did talk about him, he is in a Marxist, a left Marxist, Trotskyist militia, but the militia behaves very much like an anarchist militia, and Orwell has said, if I had known the situation, if I'd understood the situation better, I would have joined the anarchists. But instead, he joined the POUM, who are allied with the anarchists. And the anarchists are in control of Barcelona at this point.
Yeah, we join him coming back from the front on a train in a boxcar with a bunch of other conscripts. And if you ever have the image of hyper competent, very dour people being warriors, Get that out of your head, because that's really not how it is. Because these guys are very typical in that they're sitting on this train for a very long time, and they're literally using the bladders that they're keeping their liquor in to spray it across the train into each other's mouths. So it's a very, very tight community, but a very a moment of levity in an otherwise dour situation.
From what I remember of the soldiers that I know, including you, yeah, that sounds about right.
Oh yeah, I'm surprised he's not talking about what they're drawing on the walls. And if you guys know any military humor, you know exactly what they're drawing on the walls. I don't want to get Brenton's team demonetized.
I don't know what military people draw on the walls.
Exactly what you think they do. He does mention that they're drinking red wine and anise, which is not the body part, but the licorice flavored like Spanish liqueur. And it was really funny because as I was reading this, I had literally just bought a bottle of Sambuca, which is like the Italian equivalent for me. I'm very stereotypical, guys. I'm sorry. He also notes that while he's on the carriage, that there's a 15-year-old child soldier on the train with them, relating tales of his combat prowess, which are almost completely obviously untrue to less experienced people who are believing it. That's something that always happens. I've noticed something that as I've gotten out of the military and joined veterans groups, like half the people I meet were like sniper, ranger, special forces guys, and they really weren't. But like the fish story just keeps getting out of control. It's one of the reasons I don't tell combat stories publicly. But more importantly, there's a 15-year-old kid who's coming back from a tour on the front on this train, and that's something that you should keep in mind. As you're reading any story like this about war, is that horrific things like this happen. This conflict started perhaps with the best of intentions to beat fascism, but the price of a civil war is horrible stuff like this. Like a 15-year-old kid has to go to war. Thankfully, he's coming back, though.
Yeah, so far. We'll see. Things sadly do not go well for the Spanish Republic for a number of reasons. So he's on the train. One of the things that it's very interesting that you mention the kind of people who are the fish story about combat getting big, because you can very much see a 15-year-old kid doing that. But a lot of people do it, and I've always used to say that in every small town, everyone has an uncle who was a Navy SEAL. And has the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Or 3. I've met a lot of people like that, and it's really weird. But some people are put in your life to be a negative example, and I think me running into those people has kept me from doing that.
Absolutely,
because it's real easy to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can see getting sucked into it and like really trying to. Like as a storyteller myself, I don't exaggerate, partially because I'm a good storyteller. I know how to make stuff that doesn't sound like incredibly engaging, that isn't high concept. Still, if you go into the details of it, you can have someone understand what you were feeling, as opposed to trying to express your feelings by manipulating the facts, essentially. Facts don't care about your feelings. That is copyright. That is me. I said that.
You're too tall.
What's really funny, by the way. So I wrote a play called Trolling 101, and in it, the troll literally, and this was before Ben Shapiro. So in it, like the troll is sitting there, and he's like, in the cold vacuum of cyberspace, feelings don't matter, opinions don't matter, you don't matter. And then like a year later, like freaking Ben Shapiro is up there with his catchphrase, "Facts don't care about your feelings." And I'm just like, I'm pretty sure he wasn't in the audience.
you summoned him. That's what happened. Good work.
Either that or I was just tapping into a piece of a dickhead on the internet, because everybody, the Ben Shapiro "Facts don't care about your feelings" argument, I guarantee you he got that from a forum somewhere where he was posting. Somebody else used it, and then he just turned it into a catchphrase.
Not to get too far onto the tangent, but I had an origin story for that phrase in mind myself, and it was actually probably one of his professors at one of the Ivy League schools that he went to. I think this is a guess. I think one of his professors would have told him that when he turned in some sort of like right-wing polemic as like a poli-sci 101 assignment.
Oh, wow. Oh, from BZ Douglas here, by the way. BZ's a good friend of mine and an activist. I actually came across the media I created for Trolling 101 on an old hard drive. I would love to get a hold of that because, yeah, BZ did this awesome job with the play where he created basically a projectile background that was our version of the internet. So to continue on to the book here, not to get too far off.
Yeah, sorry guys.
Yeah, so Orwell is he's coming back to Catalonia. Kids telling the fish story. Go.
Yeah, so I've got a little quote here that I wanted to read. It's everyone who has made 2 visits at the intervals of months to Barcelona during the war has remarked upon the extraordinary changes that took place in it. And curiously enough, whether they went there in August and again in January, or like myself, first in December and again in April, the thing they said was always the same. The revolutionary atmosphere had vanished. No doubt anyone who had been there in August, when the blood was scarcely dry in the streets and the militia were quartered in the smart hotels, Barcelona in December would have seemed bourgeois. To me, fresh from England, it was liker to a workers' city than anything I had conceived possible. Now the tide had rolled back. Once again, it was an ordinary city, a little pinched and chipped by the war, but with no outward sign of working class predominance. So this is something interesting that happens when you go to war in general, or when you leave a place for a really long time. Stuff keeps going on without you. In my case, when I went to Afghanistan, it was about 10 and a half months that I missed from American pop culture. And I missed the whole dawn of the anti-SJW movement. I missed Donald Trump. I did. I missed Donald Trump, kind of starting his presidential run, but I kind of was still around for the real beginning of it. I missed a lot of popular culture and movies and music. America was still pretty stable, so it wasn't as bad as this, but I felt like I had missed out on a lot of stuff. And the people who are living in Barcelona, as the changes that Orwell's outlining here take place, they don't notice it because it's gradual.
Mm-hmm.
But Orwell's been gone for a period of a few months, so he's expecting it to be the same as when he left it. So he notices all of these little details in much more stark way than somebody who had been living there the whole time would have.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's really interesting that he does that, and that he's a writer, and we get to read his his observations.
Well, and he was really taken with with Barcelona when he first came in. He talked his description of Barcelona prior to this was so moving that I find myself moved by it years after. What's interesting, one of the things that I really liked about it and that I really latched onto was the fact that no one no one was using the and in English, we don't have an honorific form of speech and a regular form, but they were saying to instead of usted, and a lot of these very hierarchical ways of relating with people, with shopkeepers stooping and the hand wringing and the overly ingratiating behavior, all of this had disappeared. And everybody was doing their best to look like a militiaman.
Yeah, even on the train as he's coming back, they're kind of he noticed it as being invaded by peasants, but people who are vendors are using the train for commercial purposes again, and he notes that a lot of the stores before he had left were selling the militia uniform, which was a very kind of unisex overall jumpsuit sort of thing. What you would kind of, no offense, expect anarchists with no sense of bourgeois class to put out as a very utilitarian garment are being replaced with summer suits again. So it's kind of rolling back the gains that the revolution had initially.
And this has been going on for quite some time. It also has to do with the increased power of the PSUC, which is the Stalinists, because as no one would help the Republic. No one would even sell them weapons, except of course for the USSR. And so as the USSR came in, what was a relatively minor party became incredibly important, since they were directly associated with Moscow. And so as the much needed weapons, and even Orwell admits this, that the Russians you needed the Russians there, because if they hadn't gotten the Russians, they would have been up against fascist Italy, fascist Spain, and fascist Germany, and the Condor Legion, and Texaco, pretty much by themselves with a bunch of antique rifles and handmade bombs, and you can't win a war that way. So, the fact that the Soviet help came with, tanks and planes, this meant a lot to people. But it resulted in a rollback of the revolution, largely because Stalin was not interested in really continuing the revolution, because he was worried it would piss off the other, liberal powers and get everybody against the USSR, because pretty much everyone was already against the USSR at this point.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we're seeing kind of like a small privileged class emerge in this quote unquote revolutionary city. He notes specifically that he sees, and I quote, fat, prosperous men, elegant women, and sleek cars were everywhere. It appeared that there were still no private cars. Nevertheless, anyone who was quote unquote anyone seemed to be able to command a car. So it's like you go away from a place, and it's sort of like a worker's state, and you come back and you see like the bourgeois class society completely reassert itself. And that's a weird experience that I think that he was taken aback by, even if he doesn't really admit how much of a horror it is to see this. And it's especially weird for the militia guys coming back, because they weren't privy to any of these small and subtle changes over time. They see it all at once.
Yep. And, they've been fighting and dying for this.
Yeah. And it's the same thing that they left to fight against is behind the lines. So what happens eventually is kind of put into a little bit of a stark relief here. He also notes that the Popular Army, which is the quote unquote professional army that the Spanish Republicans are trying to field against the fascists, is replacing the militia. That when he left Barcelona, there were hardly any Popular Army soldiers, and now they were replacing the militia on the streets, in the recruiting posters and whatnot. I thought it was interesting that the Popular Army was his officers at the rate of 1 officer to 10 men. That's about what the ratio is in the U.S. Marine Corps right now. I don't know. I should, because my beloved Army. I should know what the ratio is in the Army, but it's a little more than that. More officers in the Army, that is. So they're building a pretty standardized Western Army. He even notes that a lot of the officers had served in the militia and had been brought back from technical instruction, but the majority were people who had actually just gone to like war college instead of serving in the militia and had no actual combat experience. This is something that kind of happens with militaries, is that the military that you field to defend your society is usually politically indoctrinated to be loyal to that society for obvious and manifest reasons. Yeah. The danger here is that the different factions in the Spanish Revolution aren't all under one big monolith. So these Popular Army guys are being indoctrinated not only against the fascists and for the revolution, but they're being indoctrinated against the other militia guys.
Yeah, and if you can imagine, that's probably not a good strategy.
No.
A united front against fascism, to be like, screw the fascists and also screw those guys too.
Yeah, there's an old Roman saying, I forget who said it, some dead Roman, where it is a sweet and seemly thing for an army to be animated visibly by one spirit, which means kind of march divided, fight united is another Roman saying. And this is something that's going to come back and haunt the Spanish in a really real way in the next few chapters and throughout the rest of the war. He's even noting that the officers are being paid more than the men, which is normal for anyone who's a veteran now. I think the officer pay is like colossally more than your average or average enlisted soldier. I think a general winds up making something like $250,000 a year in the U.S. Army, plus all this benefits. It winds up being like something like $300,000 or $400,000, whereas like a brand new private makes barely $20,000 a year. But that's really weird for a quote unquote revolutionary society to start paying their men, officers and men differently. And that they're starting to have a social distinction between the officers and the men, even though it's not strictly enforced. So you see the bourgeois society kind of reasserting itself, and that's obviously bad for the goals of the revolution, but that's also bad for ideologically motivating people to fight for this revolutionary society when it's not living up to the promise of the revolution. Because
Yeah,
he's all.
because what are you
Go ahead.
what are you gonna? Well, no, I was just gonna. Imagine you are a working class person who has seen the class-based society produce fascism. You've seen the government ignore the threat of fascism over and over again. You've seen people getting starved. You've seen children losing their hands in the machines. You've seen people what's incredible is if you watch the film The Spanish Earth, you actually see at one point people lashed to a yoke like beasts of burden, pulling plows through the freaking fields. It's one of the more horrifying things to see. The Spanish Earth is a propaganda film. It was a propaganda film to try to drum up support for the Republic, but it's also a primary source. And that metaphor that you see a human reduced to an animal. I mean, that's really how these people were treated by the Spanish upper class. A big thing, I brought this up in several others, but the Spanish upper class literally hunted peasants for sport, from freaking horseback.
Who hasn't hunted a human being from horseback?
Yeah, the most dangerous game. Yeah. Imagine you're fighting to save this revolution from fascism, only to find out that Hillary Clinton came and took over in the background.
Well, we're kind of seeing that now with a lot of people being fatigued when Biden's in charge, and I'm kind of one of those guys. It's hammered home to Orwell, though, how much things have changed, though, because even though he's kind of dirty and shaggy, he didn't expect to be stared at like a weirdo when he comes back to Barcelona. But he realizes, and it's the first time he realizes how shaggy he is and how decrepit his clothes really are, when people on the streets of Barcelona start staring at him. So it's like, oh wow, that's one thing that the modern military will make you keep the uniform standards. So Orwell needs to shape up a little bit there. But
hang on for just a second. I want to bring this in. It is also worthwhile reading John McGovern's Terror in Spain, a 16-page pamphlet on the Checa-run political prison during the Civil War. Though I will also say, huge trigger warning on anything going into the red and white terrors. These are horrifying. So
especially anything to deal with the Checa in general, frankly.
Yeah. So anyway, let's continue.
Yeah. So I had lost my highlight. There I am. So going back to the moral kind of state of the society at this point, Orwell says a deep change had come over the town. There were two facts that were the keynote of all else. One was that the civil population had lost much of their interest in war, and the other was that the normal division of society into rich and poor, upper and lower class was reasserting itself. So it's super important that the people are losing interest in the war. They're doing this because the class structure is reasserting itself, and that's sapping away the ideological motivation for people to enlist. But B, they're doing it because it's kind of a faraway thing. Later, Orwell notes that the front was kind of like an imaginary thing to most of these people, and that's something that happens in most wars. When I came, go ahead. I'm sorry. No.
Well, I was just going to say where people are, it's out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, exactly, and their lust for it kind of goes away a bit, which is why the U.S. military's had such a hard time meeting recruitment over the course of global war on terror. If you look back, and even now, the other thing is that it's kind of Orwell notes that it's kind of disgusting to him that these people don't appreciate what's going on at the front, and it's also disgusting to people who come to Barcelona from Madrid or from Valencia, where there's that literal street fighting going on. And that's something that I have kind of mixed feelings about personally, because you come back from a war, especially to the United States, where we basically live in global Disneyland. And people really don't know we're at war. We've been at war for almost 20 years now, 20 years
Yeah.
in September.
It
And
was 2001, so yeah, 20 years. Jeez.
you wouldn't know it though. Like we have no rationing.
Mhm.
We have no we don't have to have a draft. We don't have like military posters any more than we did before on the streets. Our society hasn't had to be regimented. In a way, I'm kind of proud of that as somebody who's a veteran, where like my people don't have to know the ravages of war because of me. So it's one of the ways I kind of justify that to myself. And other ways, it's really gross because we're waging this horrific campaign of death and violence overseas, and you would never know it at home. And I think that's a universal thing. I'm sure if you go back far enough, like some Greek would come back from Thermopylae and be really angry that the guy's just making pots in the streets of Athens.
Yeah. Which the pot maker is like, well, do you want me to not make pots?
Pots, yeah. Have you ever been to goddamn Thermopylae? you I'm pretty sure that would be the conversation. But it's interesting to see that. For me, it's interesting, and in a way, a little darkly uplifting to see that Orwell went through the same thing I did there.
Mhm.
He notes also that it was significant that all over Spain, voluntary enlistment had dwindled from about January onwards. In Catalonia in February, there had been a wave of enthusiasm over the first big drive for the Popular Army, but had not led to an increase in recruiting. So the ideological and political feed into war, I think, as we've said in previous parts of this, war is politics continued through violence, right?
Yeah.
But your political structure is what's going to field your militia and your military. And when enthusiasm for your political structure wanes, voluntary enlistment into your military is also going to wane. And that's happening here too. That's another consequence of them going back on
Yeah.
their revolutionary promises.
Because at first everybody's all excited. We're doing this new thing. It's not so much that we're just fighting against fascism, but we're fighting for something in much the same way that we look at, talk to a Bernie person and compare them to, part of the K hive or whatever. You got the cult of personality surrounding these particular politicians, but the kind of revolutionary zeal that you'll see from especially that we saw from Sanders supporters when it was really looking like Bernie was going to take this. I mean, to squeeze him out like that just kills that. And ultimately, Biden beat Trump, not nearly by what he should have, but a big part of the reason why he did not have the landslide that he should have was Bernie had been out. And so what exactly are we fighting for? We're fighting for Obama again. We didn't like that before.
Yeah, and you're seeing it now. There's already fatigue, and we're barely into 2021. So this is a lesson that you can take from war and apply it to other things. In this case, electoral politics, which you should be engaged in, even though it's super depressing.
Yeah.
Do what I do and drink to excess. It helps.
I should. I was drinking the last of my mead today.
It's funny. I'm actually having a local Florida beer called High Lie, and no one can pronounce it correctly because no one knows what High Lie is, but that's a different stream.
Jalia.
Yeah,
I know what High Lie is.
Yeah.
That's that crazy sport with the arm that shoots the ball.
Yeah, it was all a front for the mafia. Anyway, this is the quote that I had from Orwell. The front had come to be thought of as a mythical, far-off place to which young men disappeared and either did not return or returned after 3 or 4 months with vast sums of money in their pocket. A militiaman usually received his back pay when he went home on leave. Wounded men, even when they were hopping about on crutches, did not receive any special consideration. To be in the militia was no longer fashionable. The shops, always barometers of public taste, showed this clearly. When I first reached Barcelona, the shops, poor and shabby though they were, had specialized in militiamen's equipment, forge caps, zipper jackets, Sam Brown belts, and hunting knives. This is like every 511 tactical store in the country and every USA Patriot on a military base. And I love you, Orwell, but you are such a boot buying all that crap. Water bottles, revolver holsters, where he never had a pistol. And I know he bought a revolver holster. I can feel it. I can feel it in my bones that he bought one. Were displayed in every window. Now the shops were remarkably smarter, but the war had been thrust into the background. And as I discovered later when buying my kit, with that revolver holster, I see you, George. Before going back to the front, certain things had one badly needed at the front were very difficult to procure. So you can see that consumer production is taking priority over necessary defense production at this point.
Which again, capitalism reasserting itself.
Capitalism, and you'll see this in other. Ironically, you'll see this in Nazi Germany over the course of World War II, because they only nationalized their economy after the Battle of Kursk, and it was over the objections of Hitler, who still wanted to keep producing consumer goods for the population. War production is super important in war, guys. I don't know if I have to explain why for you. You need bullets to beat the other guys with bullets. is the long and short of it. But also, everywhere you went, you were met with the same perfunctory remark: "This war is terrible, isn't it? When is it going to end?" Politically conscious people were far more aware of the internecine struggle between anarchist and communist than of the fight against Franco. To the mass of people, the food shortage was the most important thing. So to the people who are trying to live through this, obviously they want to be fed. But to the people who are paying attention, the more important conflict seems to be the ones between the communists and the anarchists. Because in their mind, behind the lines, isolated from the material deprivation of war, Franco's been chased back to Zaragoza and he's not an immediate threat.
Yeah.
But now we have to have the pure ideology.
The ideology fight. Yeah, no. And, it's very interesting also because you mentioned that this is the time that they started to have food shortages.
Yeah.
Now, this is really interesting. And if you read Adam Hochschild's book on this, which is Spain in Our Hearts, it's a phenomenal book. And Adam Hochschild is not an anarchist. He is very much a liberal. In fact, he makes a very stupid criticism of anarchism in this book because he just doesn't understand it. But he's also a pretty good historian. And so he points out and you see him not connecting two and two, that the massive food production boom that they had previously had, where everybody was fed, as soon as private property rights were reasserted by the government in Barcelona, suddenly there is a black market, and suddenly there are shortages where there were no shortages before. And I'm just sitting there and I'm like, Adam, please put two and two together. It is the reintroduction of private property and capitalism that gets us to this state, the gradual reintroduction. And the way that this was justified was, oh, guys, we're at war. We don't have time for your airy nothings. We don't have time for your idealism. We need to just go back and get this money in and get stuff running and win the war. And they did it, and it sounds good to people because they're like, well, let's default to the tried and true because things are really serious now and we can experiment later. But it was that revolutionary fervor that was keeping people fed and keeping the militia system running and keeping people ideologically interested in the war. And so as this gets further and further undermined, things get worse and worse and worse for the Republic overall.
Yeah, and what's happening with the Popular Army kind of feeds into that, because he notes that while the militias have been actually holding the line against the fascists, and the militias have been responsible for pretty much all of the victories, the Popular Army has been being trained behind the line, and it's being trained along the lines of a traditional, what we would think of now as a Western military. So they're defaulting back to that old structure. But they're not really good at that old structure, one, because they're not fascists, and two, because most of the professional officers and staffers had defected to the fascists at the beginning of the war. Yeah. So they're trying to build this institution that they don't really have a great idea about at the expense of the institution, which being the militias, that's actually working. And meanwhile, they're doing propaganda against the militias all the time, giving the Popular Army the credit for victories and always referring to them as heroic, while they're referring to the militias as rabble and undisciplined and not as good as the Popular Army. They even stop parading the militiamen through the public square on their way to the trains and replace them with Popular Army guys to get the militia out of their minds as the heroes.
Yeah, and because the militia is a huge threat to the status quo, and there are a lot of people who are making decisions here who they like the status quo. They want it to continue. And honestly, a lot of them probably would prefer Franco to the whatever the militias were offering that was actually a good thing.
And it feeds into other things too, because as they're defaulting to these old structures, they're rearming and re-empowering the old police structure that they had in Barcelona. The civil guards, he calls them.
Mhm.
I'm sure they have a much cooler title in Spanish.
The La Guardia Civil.
That sounds
There
cool.
are basically two police forces, and
Yeah.
it's kind of horrifying that they're re-empowering the civil guard. The civil guard was kind of like the more rural police force, and the assault guards tended to be the guards in the cities. This is very important because the civil guard were mostly fascists, and the assault guard were mostly socialists, and they fought each other. So if you've got them behind the lines rebuilding the civil guard, yeah, you are basically introducing a fifth column, and that it becomes hilarious with how the phrase "the fifth column" starts getting used.
Yeah, and it's spoiler. It's against the actual loyal revolutionaries.
Yeah.
And he actually even notes that those civil guards are the traditional guardians of property against the propertyless class, and even that when he left originally, there were almost no beggars, and that he was interested by that fact because he had never seen a European city with so few beggars in it. And now, as he's coming back, he sees all kinds of different beggars in the street. So you do see the artificial shortages that capitalism creates by pricing people out of things like houses or food, reasserting itself. You see the structure for preserving private property, because private property can't exist without a state to enforce ownership, reasserting itself. You see the old army reasserting itself, and you see them having to conscript people into that new army because their ideological motivation that drove them in the first place is going away. So the internal politics of the worker state, quote unquote, are affecting its ability to wage a political conflict against the nominally exterior threat in Franco's fascists.
Yeah, so right here we're seeing kind of the contradictions, and we're seeing the beginning of the disease and the malignancy, which is eventually going to spell the doom for the Republic and victory for the fascists.
It is, and in the middle of this, they're actually trying to disarm the anarchist militias and put all the arms, the ability to actually have military force, in the hands of the popular army and the state. To the point where Orwell has to go on the black market to get himself a handgun. And hilariously, he doesn't know much about firearms, I don't think, because he says that he got himself a 26 millimeter automatic pistol, which he called a wretched weapon. I don't know what kind of handgun that would be, because a 26 millimeters is about an inch. A 50 cal bullet is a 50 cal bullet because it's about half an inch. So he's either wrong about what he bought, or he bought an ungodly hand cannon.
He calls a wretched weapon.
A wretched weapon, except at like 5 feet. Probably only because a bullet that big would only fly about 5 feet with the powder. He's got like some sort of blunderbuss.
Well, a lot of these weapons are antiques left over from World War I.
Oh, he said it was automatic though, so like either he's got like a Gen like -57 Desert Eagle with a bigger bullet, or he's wrong about what he bought.
What do you think? What do you think, Orwell? He's meeting with this Black Army smuggler who's French, because
of course he is.
Yeah, but also because it was the French who were smuggling the weapons here. He's meeting with this Black Army smuggler, and he's Orwell, and he's looking through like all of the black market weapons he can get. What does Orwell go for? Does he go for the giant Desert Eagle, or does he try to find himself like a James Bond gun?
See, I'm thinking about that, and we've got a few choices here back at this point. He can go Austrian, which is super classy back then. If you're listening to this, look up a Farmer's Stop or a Bergman 9. The Bergman 9 is what the Mandalorian's using on the Mandalorian. That's a really classy pistol. Wow. He could go for a Luger, He could go for like a Beretta, old school Beretta, like M1935 or something like that. But those are all fascist guns, aren't they? So like, would he compromise and go for the fascist gun, or would he get some like weird like Spanish like gun? I'm thinking he got like a Ruby, a pistolet Ruby, which was the French standard issue automatic pistol in World War One. But that's just my guess. He either got a Ruby, or I think he might have gotten like a broom handle.
So what's the caliber on the bullet in the Ruby?
I think it's like a 380.
380.
So it's a small bullet.
Okay. Well,
a 32 maybe, ACP. I looked it up.
Yeah, 30. Okay, 32 ACP. I don't know what that means.
It's a really tiny bullet. There's actually a funny story behind that has to do with racism. no kidding. Part of it is because automatic pistols actions couldn't handle really high caliber rounds for a little while because they were new. But also there was this racist idea in Europe that white people would get hit one time by a low caliber bullet and go down and stop fighting, whereas you had to use a high caliber bullet against savages. So for their continental armies, the Europeans would go to like tiny like 32 caliber 380s or like 32 S&W revolvers. Wow. And then the United States discovered in the invasion of the Philippines that doesn't really stop somebody who's charging at you with a machete. So they switched over to 45 ACP, which is a man-stopping bullet. So that's your little arms history for today. But yeah, he definitely went for something French, I think.
I love it. White people, you can hit them with a little bullet.
Yeah,
you gotta use a big bullet. Guy's basically a bear.
yeah, for real. It's kind of sick.
That is really messed up. All right, so he gets this handgun, which he puts in his holster. In his holster
that he definitely bought. We also have a really interesting passage about the tobacco shortage. And as a cigar smoker, this really made me feel for poor George, because he's noting that the fascists actually control the Canary Islands, where the traditional supply of tobacco comes from ever since Spain was kind of cut off from Cuba and the Spanish-American War. And having had Canary Island tobacco before in my life, I'm so sorry for anyone in Spain. That is awful tobacco. Like, oh God. But the government had limited the amount of foreign cigarettes that could be officially imported because they're on the gold standard at this point.
Right.
And this is the really kind of boring part that I said I would put everyone to sleep with. Excuse me. It's really interesting that they have to worry about keeping the gold reserves up because this isn't actually a problem that we have now. After we transition to what is basically modern petrodollars, we don't have to physically keep gold in our reserves, and we don't have to trade internationally based on how much gold we have. This does a couple different things. Economically, it makes modern international industrial capitalism possible because you can trade on debt a lot easier when it's fiat money than it is when you're physically trading on gold. The other thing that it does is it allows us to wage really long wars without running out of gold. Because at this point in history, you have to remember, countries' ability to wage war and buy war materials was still contingent on the amount of gold that they had in the treasury. And as they exported their gold, they would eventually run into a point where they couldn't buy new war materials. Yeah. And he mentions it offhand here, but it's actually a strategic importance that these poor bastards can't get their cigarettes because they have to keep the gold up to buy war material, whereas the fascists, you noted, are being funded by Germany, Italy, or what was it, Texaco?
Texaco. And Franco, and interestingly enough, this is the old economy running into the new economy because Texaco is just basically fronting Franco all the oil he needs on credit.
Meanwhile, these guys have to worry about their war material to the point they have to limit the amount of cigarettes that they're importing. Mm-hmm. Conspicuous consumption has also made a return in Barcelona. He notes that there's a quote here, a fat man eating quails while children are begging for bread is a disgusting sight, but you are less likely to see it when you are within the sound of the guns. So it's kind of ironic that they're sort of practicing socialism as he understands it, and as close as he ever understands it in real life, on the front, whereas in the rear, all of the old ugliness of capitalism and it's reasserting itself. At this point, he's actually trying to leave the POOM and join the CNT's International Brigade, or the FAI militia, and the Foreign Brigade. And he notes that, ironically, if they had sped up his paperwork and kind of like allowed him to transfer the way he wanted to, he wouldn't have actually seen what happens next. Because and we would have lost this account, and maybe he would have felt very much differently about the
Probably, honestly, with what happens next,
yeah.
just so you guys know, to all of you listening, what happens next is the reason he wrote Animal Farm and the reason he wrote 1984. I don't think either of those books would exist without the experience that's about to come. So.
No, a little lighthearted thing before we start. He notes that he hadn't had sweets or any sugar at the front, and that he came back and he gorged himself so much that he was kind of in ill health. He points it out. So I'm assuming he's like hungover and sugar high all the time. That is a real thing, man. Like when I was deployed the longest, I was in the best shape of my life when I got back because I ate really healthy food that they gave me. I exercised all the time because I didn't have anything else to do, and I did my job all the time. So when I got home, I was like super in shape. And then like the first thing I did was I got some Five Guys and I started ruining it. Started drinking really heavily. That happens to the soldiers throughout history, and it is really funny. Like I'm sure like every variant of Warrior that's happened to, and that happens to Orwell. So I think I love reading these things through his eyes because he's a very I don't want to make fun of Orwell, but he's a very effete guy. Like he's a very upper crusty British guy. So when he starts to experience these like to use his terminology, these things for like the proles experience, it's really funny for me. Endearing in a way too.
Orwell is kind of like he's almost like he's not a class tourist because he actually does do the stuff. He's not just there to live vicariously as one of the poors. Like if you read Down and Out in Paris and London, for instance, like he lives very poor, like, and very rough. Like he's living with homeless people essentially. And then on top of that, you know, you've got him actually there on the front. It's one of the things that I really honestly admire about Orwell is that he's not just like he's there and he's there to take part and write, but you know, he wants to actually live this thing that he's writing about. And as someone who has been accused of being a method writer on a number of occasions, and honestly, I won't say it's quite half the reason, but a big reason as to why I went down to join Occupy Wall Street and like to, you know, really throw myself headfirst into the anarchist movement was so that I could write about Spain, so that I could write Durruti, which, by the way, comic book is coming. So, you know, it's very important to understand something to write about it, you know, like in very much the same way that I wrote about the Appalachian Trail. I wrote that after I'd hiked the whole thing, Maine to Georgia. Fun fact, by the way, when I moved to New York, these other guys, I won't mention their name or anything, but they had written a play about the Appalachian Trail around the same time. Mine beat theirs, and theirs was a musical. And I saw like on their social media, they're like, hey, after we wrote this play about the Appalachian Trail, we went on the Appalachian Trail for one day. Look at our pictures. And I was just like, so, you know, Orwell, there is an authenticity to what he writes about, despite him, you know, having this bourgeoisie background.
That's the appealing thing. That it's alien to him, but it's not repulsive. It's what makes it amusing is his earnestness. Because if it was somebody that was repulsed by it, it would be more annoying than anything. It would be very typical. But this is kind of atypical in how endearing it winds up being for me.
Absolutely.
This is the point, though, when the militias and the central government are starting to kind of fight each other. On the French frontier, a band of carbineros, which is like kind of like an old kind of military gendarmerie force, were sent to seize a customs office controlled by anarchists, and a well-known anarchist was killed. There were like unofficial brawls between the CNT and the UGT in the working class suburbs. So we're starting to see like the political end of the central government, which is to establish basically kind of like a liberal bourgeois state, be carried out through them structuring their political institutions seizing controls of things like customs office, reasserting the power of the property guarding police, making a traditional army to replace the militias. We see that like these things are gradual, but they have very real effects. And when politics turns into violence, other memes that Clausewitz talks about, it happens real fast, but there's a lot of buildup to it. There's a lot of antagonism and kind of like argument and negotiation that goes on before actual violence breaks out. So that's something that's kind of very interesting to note. But the brawls actually turn up into a series of murders and retaliatory attacks, but the central government controls the propaganda apparatus, so they're only talking about the left communists' violence and not their own violence against the militias and the other parties in the government. So we see the seeds of what's going to happen in the civil war within a civil war that's about to start. Yep. Happening here. And it's worthy to note this because people kind of have this negative tendency to think that wars and conflicts just kind of happen because a mean man wants it to. They have deep political causes, and we can see the deep political divides between the militias and the central government heating up into what would actually become a shooting war very soon.
Yeah, and in a way, it's kind of mirroring what happened before, the fascists attacked, because there were killings and reprisal killings, and there was propaganda, and so it's like they're doing the same thing again, and they're repeating the same cycle, but they're doing it to themselves. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that the government, the liberal government, wants to stay in charge, but it doesn't want to offer people anything worth fighting for. And it also doesn't want to piss off Stalin. And so, like, what you essentially have is you've got one force's, like, their big message is no passerà. You shall not pass. Now, I love Gandalf. You shall not pass.
Was that published at that point? I wonder.
I don't know if it was, but I'm almost certain that he got that idea without realizing it from the slogan "No passerà," because I know he fought in World War I, and a lot of Lord of the Rings might have had a lot to do with like dealing with the trauma of war and coming back, which is why, like, the book Return of the King ends, and then there's still a third of the book left to go.
Well, something that not a lot of people note about that is that people always say that the orcs are a metaphor for the Germans in that book, but when he was asked about it, Tolkien said that we were all orcs in the war. So you as a person are not represented by the happy elves or the noble humans. We're all represented by the awful orcs, and that's what people are like in war.
Well, he's 100% right. And the thing is that what I love also is that Tolkien started identifying as an anarchist towards the end of his life, which was really awesome.
Did he really? I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. He said it was in a letter to his son. He said the older he gets, the more he's attracted to the ideas of anarchy, because so few men are actually fit to lead. It's a much better quote than the one that I just said, but the no passerà, and this is something that I wanted to get at because it's something that Hillary tried, and I see the Democrats try it again and again. And every time this political tactic is tried, it fails. And it's the slogan of "Love trumps hate," or "No passerà." Yeah. Or there was one, the second I saw that this slogan, there was a slogan which was just "not him," that was used in Bolsonaro. What country is that?
Brazil.
Yeah, I was thinking B, and I was getting tangled.
You're close.
But yeah, but they used the slogan "not him," and the second I saw that, I'm like, well, it's going to be him now. You freaking idiots. Because people do not respond to a negative. You have to give them a positive. You have to give them something to grab onto in order to really motivate them. And that's true in sales, it's true in management, and it's true in war and in political conflict. And so when your message, you think, I'm going to appeal to all of the sensible people, and we're just going to be against this guy, you have a negative message and the other person has a positive message, and almost always the person with the positive message just winds up winning and bowling you over, because there is so much more power in taking a stance than on riding the fence.
I agree 100%. And for a difference, you can actually look at 2008, where it was hope and change was Obama's slogan. It's vague enough that everyone can buy into it because you can project your own hopes and the change that you want to see onto it, but it's positive enough for people to buy into. And then, like you said, juxtapose that with 2016 Hillary Clinton, I'm with her, where it's making it all about Hillary Clinton, not about anything really like positive policy goals. It's a disaster. And in this case, in Barcelona, we have this government paying lip service to the revolutionary ideals that kind of brought it into existence, but in fact reasserting the old bourgeois society that it rebelled against. And you see people buying into it less, because now instead of having this revolutionary fervor where these guys are willingly joining the militias, you have them having to be conscripted off the streets and
forced to fight. And then, of course, when they get captured by the fascists, they just join the fascists.
Yeah, and
now,
the fascists might be. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, there was something else that I wanted to add in here, because again, the whole "No pasaran" slogan, and this is very big. That we're going to put a line here in the country, and Franco's not going to get past it. Again, it's if you're playing defense, you're going to lose.
Well, Clausewitz actually has a thing about that on war. He says that defense is the strongest form of warfare, but the only possibility of victory lies in the attack. And that's true throughout military history, because like you're saying, when you're on the defensive, your lines of supply are usually relatively short because you're usually defending your own territory. You don't have to maneuver because you're just kind of static. Your enemy has to make the first move so you can see where they're coming from. But you're never going to win because the enemy can just wear down your defenses over time. You don't have the initiative, and they keep their resources. So you have to make the enemy to win in a war. This is again Clausewitz. Read on War Kids, great book, really dry, super not depressing actually, but very dry.
The only book that you have is a dry book,
like my martinis. But
well, before we get back to this, by the way, I just want to point out, I have right here Nestor Makhno, the other major anarchist militant, along with Buenaventura Durruti, and I'm very happy. They call him Batko, by the way, which means father. And he's the guy that, among other things, raised a massive army of anarchists to fight and deal the final blows against the White Army during the Russian Revolution. Like, without Nestor Makhno, there probably would have been no USSR. Like, the Whites might have actually won.
I thought it was Stalin single-handedly.
Say what?
I thought it was Stalin single-handedly.
Well, that's what the tankies will tell you. But one of the things to show this is like when you're outgunned, the idea of trying to be defensive is a losing battle. And you can see it because what Nestor Makhno did to defeat the White Army was he retreated and retreated and retreated for like a month. Losing more and more land, but what he wound up doing was, in order for the whites to keep up with him, they had to overextend themselves past their supply lines.
Yes.
In the end, he won basically by flanking them with a horseback attack with freaking sabers, and obliterated the White Army with this. And had he not done that, they would have marched. And probably I think it was Petrograd they would have retaken. I need to remember exactly what city it was, but it was a major one.
Which is St. Petersburg now, for those of us who aren't communists.
Yeah. So St. Petersburg, and that might have been it. Like, that would have been the beginning. That very potentially would have been the beginning of the end of the Red Army as well. But Nestor Makhno was actually so brilliant; he was able to do that. And then of course all the anarchists were rounded up and executed, and Mr. Machno had to flee to France.
as you do.
Yeah.
But
this was another thing that I wanted to point out, by the way, because you talked about the government.
Yeah.
So in Barcelona, this is important to understand about the government. Initially, the anarchists, when they took over Catalonia, they were offered positions in control of the government, of the state, and most refused because they were anarchists. And people will say it was a good idea to do that, it was a bad idea to do that. When they refused to take those positions wound up being taken by Stalinists. And so the government, the government of Barcelona, and then of course the government of the Republic in Spain, these were not the people that had defeated fascism. These were the people that had been defeated by fascism and were getting their butts kicked and had been revolted against by fascism and had been saved by the anarchists. Then later the anarchists did enter government, but probably too late to do anything. And there's a bunch of ways to relitigate if something would have been different if the anarchists had taken power in the government sooner. I'm of the mind that probably not, but largely that's just because of what they were up against and the fact that they didn't have the actual hardware that they needed to win this war. If they'd had the military factories in the South, might have been a difference. But yeah.
And there's no way to answer it counterfactual, but you can take the lesson that even as an anarchist, if your position is to abolish the state, that's a transitional thing. You're not going to just immediately establish it. And if that apparatus still exists, you need to be at least aware, if not in control, of how it's being used. And we see what happened is that, as you say, they didn't enter government for a very long time, and that government created a structure that was basically designed to crush them.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, continue. Let's.
No, I was just blundering on about Clausewitz, but towards the end of this chapter, Orwell notes that there's going to be a huge demonstration between the CNT and the UGT. The CNT being more moderate. We're trying to reconcile with the UGT, which I guess is more radical.
Well, the CNT or the CNT Phi, those are the anarchists.
Right. My bad.
The Phi is like the hardline anarchists. The CNT, the Confederación Nacional Trabajo, so the National Confederation of Workers, they are more moderate compared to the Phi and compared to other like split off groups like the Friends of Durruti, for instance, because this is after Durruti has been killed. And I can see why the CNT would be trying to come to an understanding with the UGT, because again, they've got to fight the fascists. The UGT is the Union Generale Trabajo. So like, think of like the CNT is the Wobblies, the IWW in America, except much bigger. And the UGT is like the AFI-CIO, like the really establishment. And at this point, the UGT is controlled by Stalinists.
I had a chart for all of these things, but I spilled coffee on it. Anyway, the demonstration's actually called off, and it's May Day, May 1st, and he notes that it's the only non-fascist city in Europe that didn't have any celebrations on May Day, despite being a revolutionary city, which is kind of depressing. But he was actually really happy because he didn't want to have to march in the parade because, and this is the last line of the chapter, to be marching up the street behind red flags inscribed with elevating slogans, and then to be bumped off from an upper window by some total stranger with a submachine gun is not my useful way of a way to die, or my idea of a useful way to die, rather. Which is George Orwell was not subtle.
No, he was not, and that's going to go into the May Day fighting, where we talk in the next chapter. And this is one of the parts of the book that I really remember very well. So I'm very excited to get to it. With regard to chapter 10. All right. So, I mean, what's your takeaway from this? Because we've essentially seen you've come in with me. We've been with Orwell. We've been right there with him, seeing this beautiful society worth fighting for. We've gone to the front, and it's a clusterfuck. And then we're back, and what happened? Everything changed. That seems to be the journey here.
Yeah, it's a universal experience to notice how much things change. when you're at war. I think that happens to every warrior, as I said earlier. For me, American society was a little alien when I got back because I'd missed basically a year of pop culture. Um, if you read the Forever War, the book, the main character in the book winds up something like 1,000 years detached from the civilization that he knew. Great book. Hilariously, he's the only heterosexual guy left in his unit at the end, like 1,000 years later, and his men make fun of him for it, and it's really funny.
That's great.
But that's kind of what the experience is like going away. But the cool thing about this is that Orwell has that experience where he notices the most minute changes in the society that he's fighting for, in a society that's undergoing rapid change. So he gets to see it in stark detail. The tendency,
what makes this memoir so important, really, because nobody else really has this perspective.
yeah, and the tendency of liberal capitalism to reform, adapt, and reassert itself is historically noteworthy here, because you have this radically left-wing revolution that breaks out in Spain that winds up essentially with liberal capitalism as the central tenet of it. It's notable for people who want to organize to move past the late stage capitalism that we're in, that these power structures don't just go away because we don't like them anymore, and that you have to address them. Sometimes you have to use them against themselves, in my opinion. And you can overcome them, but it's a long process that you need to pay a lot of attention to, because if you don't pay attention, the centrists and the people who don't actually want to do change get back in power. Also, it's notable what we're talking about, the broader war, is that we're talking, we've talked about the political causes of war, but we haven't talked about how the political institutions in a country affect their ability to wage war. And we've been able to discuss that a little bit in this chapter by talking about the popular army, the reasserting of the constabulary, and the attempt to replace the militia system. In this case, I would argue that ideology on the behalf of the central government to reestablish a traditional Western military trumped practicality.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And what's ironic is that they dressed that up and justified it to themselves as saying we're being practical.
Yes, and that's something that's happening now too. We've mentioned earlier here that we've been at war and the global war on terror for 20 years with little to no gain, but ideologically, our political class has committed to that war and does not want to lose it. So we're fighting a purely ideological conflict with no material goal. So we don't know what winning looks like, so we can't actually win. And it's even worse in some ways than
what happens when you declare war on an idea?
Yeah. 20 years of this.
Jeez. All right, so we're gonna be getting into the fighting, but I guess this was like the perfect Bobby chapter because it's depressing.
Yeah, and I got to talk about the gold standard.
Yeah. Well, and the gold standard. This is actually really important, and there's another reason why Spain is putting those restrictions on importing cigarettes and everything. So Spain going into the Spanish Civil War is one of the wealthiest countries on earth because they have all of the gold from their former empire. And what happened was that so Spain's got all this money, but their military goes fascist for the most part. So and captures all of their war industry. So now they're the rich guy with a ton of stuff, but no real allies or weapons, and they could very easily buy the weapons, but no one will sell it to them. And so, of course, Stalin comes knocking and says, "I'll help you. By the way, what are you doing with that gold?" And they took basically all of the gold from the Bank of Spain and spirited it away to Moscow, like on a ship. And there is, I'm not going to go so far as to say this because I don't pretend to know Stalin's mind, but a lot of people were speculated that one of the reasons he didn't put the kind of support that was needed behind the Republic, and essentially, not the kind of support that fascist Italy and fascist Germany and Texaco were putting behind Franco, was that his goal was simply to get the gold and test his weapons because he knew a fight was coming against Germany. That's part of it, but also I think at the time Russia had also been like they were still recovering. So to give the Russians a little bit of credit here, it may have simply been that this was the best they could do with the circumstances that they had. And you know what? It's much better that the gold wound up in Moscow than in fascist hands.
Well, also the line of supply from Russia, Soviet Russia, to Spain is astronomically long for modern.
Compared to the line of supply from Germany and Italy.
Yeah. You have to go all the way around.
If Stalin commits enough and puts enough troops in Spain, he's gonna piss off the French and the Americans and.
Well, how are they even going to get there? The Soviet Navy at the time wasn't really a match for other blue water navies, and then how are you going to supply them when they get there? Because you need beans and bullets for your guys, and if you can't get them their beans and bullets, they can't fight. And you need gasoline. Patton famously said, "My soldiers can eat their belts, but my tanks got to have gas." So, I mean, like, how are you going to get the gas to them? It's a difficult problem. And again, I tend to side more towards where you're at. I think it's also just worth noting that some people think, like, why didn't the Soviet Union just send like multiple divisions to Spain and win the war? I don't think that's a practical solution.
Yeah, how the hell do you do that?
Exactly. Yeah, you can't.
It's really funny also because the people that they did send were Russians in insignia-less uniforms, which must have been badass.
Well, I mean, it's not hard to tell a Russian from a Spaniard usually, especially when it's like, "Da, hola, I am Ivansky." Oh crap! You know I'm Russian.
Oh my! And you know what? I think that accent is officially racist. You, sir, are canceled.
I'm canceled. Oh no! I'll get a job at Ben Shapiro's channel tomorrow.
So to go over a couple of comments here, because we've got here. I don't know. I think this is a joke. Mm-hmm. But this came from Anarcho Alex. Communism is bad and not based. Capitalism is good and based because human nature. I don't think that's a joke. I think he's actually referencing because I was talking about bad arguments when this showed up.
Yeah, because the number one way you know somebody's a pseudo-intellectual when you're speaking to them is when they start talking about human nature and they don't justify it. They just appeal to it.
Well, what was it Emma Goldman famously said? Poor human nature. Every fool from king to policeman to a flat-headed parson to visionless dabbler in science presumes to speak authoritatively about human nature. The more the dumber these people are, the more their insistence on the wickedness and weakness of human nature is. So but did want to address that comment. We also have right here from Tayaganda. So this is a guy I've run into this guy in a number of anarchist groups. So Orwell used to be a Trotskyite, and his experience in Catalonia helped him understand anarchist syndicalism. Yes, he did not used to be a Trotskyite. He was just in a Trotskyite party. Because he didn't really know what the hell was going on when he showed up. I halfway think he joined it just because it was the Lenin barracks, and he was like, "Oh, okay, communists."
Yeah, that when you don't speak the language, that's probably a good way to go.
Yeah. So we had talked about this, the George McGovern's Terror in Spain pamphlet. So I will have to check that one out. Or did I say George? John McGovern. John McGovern, Scottish anarchist and a member of the ILP, like Orwell was. So I was not aware of John McGovern, so I will have to check that out. Beyond that, I think those are the relevant comments. So before we end, do you want to plug your pluggables, Bobby?
Yeah, I'm Mustache Mafia on YouTube. I haven't been putting out a lot of content lately because I've been busy. That's hopefully going to change soon. Mustache Mafia on SoundCloud. Mustache Bob 2 on Twitter. If you're a Mustache Bob 1, contact me because I want to know what the story behind that is. And there can only be one. So we have to fight to the death on top of the Silver Cup studio in New York after the pandemic ends. Safety first.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am Brenton Lengel. I'm the author of, among other things, Snow White Zombie Apocalypse, the Kickstarter of which has closed, and we currently have a pre-order store up on BackerKit. And we are about to go into production. We're actually making a special Swaza coin. It's going to be the coin of the realm. It's going to be a gold coin featuring the blood-covered king. So check that out and some other stuff. We're making a tarot deck. And right around the corner, I'm launching 2 new series that I think a lot of people will be very interested in. One is called NPCs, about the lives of non-player characters in role-playing games. And if anyone's wondering if I got that from the NPC meme, no, I didn't. I came up with this on my own and did the opposit of the NPC meme.
You know, I had a thought about that.
Yeah.
God, it might not be appropriate for stream, but I was playing Cyberpunk 2077.
Yeah, and you found me in there. You're the second person that's found me in.
Was it the same one?
No, different.
Yeah, okay.
So apparently the designers of Cyberpunk are either that or I just look like some sort of like wasteland hobo. So what was the thing?
There's a little adult content, but yeah, I'll tell you off stream, and then if it's appropriate, I'll tell you on the next one on public.
Yeah. And then the other one is, of course, I am creating Daruti, possibly titled "The Shadow of the People." This is a comic series based on a screenplay that I have. I'm getting the early art back from my Spanish artist, who is freaking incredible and knows people in the CNT-Fi, which is really exciting. And so we have connected, and I showed you some of the early art, and you rightly pointed out that Camus makes an appearance.
Yes, smoking the smoke.
Mm-hmm. And what I love about that is conceivably Camus could have been there.
Yeah, he might have been. I think he was writing for Combat at the. Oh no, that was a few years later.
Yeah,
during the occupation. Yeah. So
I'm just gonna believe that Camus is in that, and that he spirited himself into.
Camus is everywhere. Camus is life.
Great. So. So this has been Insurrection with Brenton Lengel, the Radical Book Club, Homage to Catalonia, Chapter 9. We will be doing Chapter 10 very soon. I do apologize that we have not had streams for a little while. Things have been crazy as I've been working to launch these titles, and I'm going to be doing fulfillment for the Kickstarter very, very soon, and then launching another one. So from me to all of you guys out there, solidarity, and keep fighting for a saner, more compassionate world. I will catch you on the flip side.